Good afternoon, everyone. I am Dr. Christina Wells, and I welcome you to our presentation this afternoon. On behalf of the Shiloh Church, the Vegan Museum, and the Lake Region Conference of Seventh-day Adventists, we welcome you to this health presentation. The Seventh-day Adventist Church believes strongly in equipping individuals and communities with information that will benefit you physically, mentally, and spiritually. And today we are partnering with the Vegan Museum to bring you another health program. In a few minutes, you will hear more about the Vegan Museum, which is currently on display at the Shiloh Seventh-day Adventist Church, located at 7000 South Michigan Avenue. But first, I'd like to introduce to you our presenter for today. And one of the things I'd like to let you know that unfortunately, Dr. Stanich from the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine will not be with us today because she had a family emergency. But we are praying for her and her family, and she has agreed to join us at another time in the future. But we're excited that we do have Dr. Schweltz with us this afternoon. And I want to tell you something about this wonderful presenter. Dr. Schweltz is currently an associate clinical professor at the University of California, Riverside School of Medicine and an assistant clinical professor at the School of Medicine and Allied Health at Loma Linda University. Roger is quadruple board certified in internal medicine, pulmonary diseases, critical care medicine, and sleep medicine through the American Board of Internal Medicine. His current practice is in Banning, California, where he is a critical care physician, pulmonologist, and sleep physician at Beaver Medical Group. And he was formerly the director for intensive care services at San Gorgonio Memorial Hospital. He lectures routinely across the country at conferences and for medical societies. He did a wonderful program for us back in 2020, and we know that we're going to be blessed again with another wonderful program today. He also is the co-founder and a presenter for MedCram. So after this presentation today, anything else that you want to know about COVID, he has many, many videos on his MedCram website. And so we're thankful that he is back with us today. But before we bring on Dr. Schweltz, we want to bring on Kay from the Vegan Museum, who's going to talk to us a little bit about the Vegan Museum. Hello, Kay, how are you?
Hello, Dr. Wells. I'm fine, thank you. And I see you're fine too.
Thank you.
Well, hello, everybody. I'm glad that you're out there listening to us. The Vegan Museum is the first such museum in the country and probably in the world. It opened 5 years ago. It's a traveling exhibit taking up about 250 square feet. It consists of 12 hinged panels. Each is about 3 feet wide by about 7 feet tall. And there's a TV screen on a stand with Victoria Moran, who is an author and a wonderful speaker. Victoria gives a 6-minute presentation on our vegetarian history. So far, we've exhibited at over 30 different Chicago and suburban cultural institutions, and we move to a different venue every 2 to 6 months. We schedule a program for the location each month that our exhibit is there. It could be a speaker, a documentary on veganism, or a food demonstration. Also, we are a not-for-profit, a 501c3, and we don't charge for bringing in the museum. I want to tell you a bit about my vegetarian background so that you understand exactly why I started this museum. I have a very long history with vegetarianism in Chicago. First as the owner of the Bread Shop, which was Chicago's first modern-day vegetarian business. I started with a bakery. I had an adjacent bulk food store, opened it in 1971. At that time, there was no other vegetarian business in Chicago. So I assumed I was the first. I then opened a restaurant, Bread Shop Kitchen, 4 years later. It stayed open for about 8 years. It's still in business, but it's owned by 2 former employees now, and under a different name. I was the president of the Chicago Vegetarian Society for 6 years. The organization that runs the museum is called Go Veggie. I started that about 20 years ago. I hosted a TV series, Go Veggie with Kay. I wrote the Veggie Cook column at the Chicago Tribune for over 4 years. So I tell you all that. Well, about 6 years ago, I was asked to speak about Chicago's vegetarian history on Live from the Heartland, which is a radio show. I felt very confident because I thought I knew all about our history. I thought I had started it. The show went well, and afterwards I began to get requests asking me to speak at other organizations. When I closed the bread shop, I didn't have a computer yet. And so this time, for the first time, I began to research vegetarian history, thinking there might be some little tidbit about Chicago's history that I didn't know. And I was astonished. I was actually thunderstruck to find that Chicago's vegetarian history goes back to the 1800s. We had vegetarian boarding houses. Our football team was vegetarian for several years. Our football team at the University of Chicago was vegetarian. The country's first turkey-free Thanksgiving dinner started in Chicago. The World's Fair, which was the first World's Fair, was called the Columbian Exposition. It was in 1893, and they hosted a large vegetarian display that was created by different vegetarian groups in other parts of the world. But once that the Columbian Exposition hosted this vegetarian display, so many people came to Chicago to see it that the center of our country's veg movement moved from Philadelphia to Chicago. Vegetarians came from all over the world to see this display. So as I said, I was just gobsmacked by learning about our history, and it fascinated me. But I realized that if I, with my background, knew nothing about our history, that in all the years I've been doing this, no one had said a word to me about it. I realized if I knew nothing about it, neither did most anyone else. And knowing that you have a history is very important. And if my contemporaries didn't know about our history, for sure young people didn't know. Youth is the largest segment of veganism. It is growing the fastest. It's also, of course, our entire future. They need to know that they have the wisdom and the support and the resources of those who came before. And of course, we can learn from the mistakes of the past and not have to repeat them. I believe that us knowing our history will make our great movement even stronger. And we don't want our history to be told in some far-off future by unknown museum custodians. We need to tell it now. We need to tell it today, while the modern pioneers are still here to set our story straight. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that history, which is rich. I always like to hear you talk about how you had a bread shop, and us as a Seventh-day Adventist church, of course, we believe that the first ever plant-based people were Adam and Eve when God created them in the Garden of Eden, and so it's wonderful to be able to think about the vast importance of how plant-based and vegans are growing around us. And I know I was looking at a statistic the other day, Kay, that might interest you, that during the pandemic, more people became interested in going plant-based, and more people also became more interested in plant-based and vegan lifestyles. And so especially in communities of color. And so that's also been exciting to know that more people are interested in plant-based and in vegan lifestyles. And so thank you.
Can I say something?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, you mentioning Adam and Eve. It's in the Bible that God said to Adam and Eve that he gave them grains and said to them, "This shall be as meat for you." It's right there in the Bible.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Thank you for bringing that out. We appreciate that. And so we thank you again. We're so glad that we were able to partner with the Vegan Museum. And we thank you again for being a part of this presentation today. And we look forward to doing more partnerships together. So thank you so much, Kay, and we'll see you later.
Thank you.
And now I'm going to bring on Dr. Schweltz. Dr. Schweltz, welcome back. How are you today?
Very good. Thank you so much, Dr. Wells.
Good, good. It's so grateful to see you. I'm so thankful that you agreed to do this program. Thank you for being a part of this presentation, and we'll give the floor to you.
Well, great. Thanks so much. You know, there's been so much talk recently about Omicron, and for people who are just casually interested in the pandemic, because we're getting kind of sick of it now. They were, why are they calling this Omicron? And it started making me think a little bit about maybe talking a little bit about variants first, and then we can talk about treatments and both some of the medications and also natural remedies that we can use as well. That's something that I think is what I'd like to focus on is the natural remedies, because I think that's unique to us. But let's just talk real quickly about what a variant is and why we have variants. So you have to remember that viruses are very different to bacteria in that the way that viruses spread is by replicating their RNA in this case into human beings. They cannot exist outside of human beings, unlike bacteria. In fact, there's a debate about whether viruses are actually alive or not, and I think it's come down that they're actually not alive because they require human cells for them to replicate. So what is a variant? So what happens is when the virus infects the human cell, it gets inside of it. It's very complicated, but basically what it does is it tries to replicate its genome, its RNA, using the machinery of the cell. And while it tries to do it and be very, have a lot of fidelity to the code to make sure that it's reproducing the code in a very specific way, the way it's supposed to be, there's going to be mistakes that are made very infrequently, but mistakes will be made. Now, just to give you the sort of the size of this, when a viral particle or virus infects the human body and it starts to replicate, the estimates is that in one human body, the virus can replicate itself up to 1 billion or even up to 1 trillion copies in just one human being. And so you can quickly see that if the error rate is even very small, that even inside of one human being, there could be tens to hundreds, maybe even thousands of viral particles that have mistakes in them, okay? All sorts of mistakes. Now, you multiply one person becoming infected times how many people are becoming infected now here in the United States with the very infectious Omicron variant, up to 1 million that we're seeing. And so 1 million times 1 trillion, you can quickly see that we're talking about an incredible amount of viral particles. And even if there's just a very small amount of mistakes, there's going to be mutants. Now, here's where it comes in, because all sorts of mutants are being made every day, all the time. We have variants being made all the time. But occasionally, just like a thief that's trying to break into a safe using a code, occasionally he's going to hit the right code. And occasionally a variant is going to be made that's going to make the variant or the virus more easily able to infect. And that's the key there, is that the thing that's going to get propagated is the one that makes it more infectious. So all the other mutations that cause the virus to become less infectious are never going to come to light because they're not going to go on to the next person. We're never going to see those mistakes. The only mistakes that we're going to see are those mistakes that confer on the virus something that allows it to be more transmissible. And that's the reason why whenever we have a new variant that we're starting to see become more and more prominent, it's usually because it's more infectious. And that's why we went from the original virus to the Delta virus, which was more infectious, and now to Omicron, which is even more infectious. The virus doesn't really want to kill the host. It's an unintended consequence of its programming, because if it kills the host, it kills its ability to reproduce. And so while we do see increased infectivity of the virus, it's not necessarily that we're going to see more virulence. Now, with Delta, we did actually see more virulence. It was a more deadly virus, about 2 times more deadly. So far, Omicron is believed to be less of a virulent virus, which means that it causes a disease in its host that's less serious on average. Everything's a distribution, of course. The problem, though, that we're having, and I can tell you this firsthand, as we speak right now, my wife, who is a hospitalist, is working at the hospital, admitting many, many, many patients, a lot of patients to the hospital, all of them with COVID-19, most of them. And I'm a critical care physician. I just got off of a whole week of working in the intensive care unit, taking care of patients who are on ventilators for Omicron. And I can tell you, if you do the math, that if you have a virus that is 7 times more infectious, but only 50% less virulent, you can do the math very quickly. You're going to be admitting more people to the hospital. So it may be more mild on an individual standpoint, but in terms of our healthcare infrastructure, we are starting to see a tremendous increase in patients being admitted to the hospital. Not yet what we saw a year ago, but certainly above where we were just a few weeks ago. So that's kind of where we are, and that's basically the understanding of variants. So let's talk a little bit about treatments, and then we can take some questions at the end. In terms of treatments, there has been a number of breakthroughs that we've had in the last 2 years. Let's just summarize some of those treatments. One of the very first things that came out from the WHO was that, whatever we try to do with patients in the hospital, we're trying to keep them supportive, use oxygen if we can, see if they improve. Remdesivir had come out early on, and the data on that was somewhat mixed. There was one trial that seemed to indicate that remdesivir was helpful. There was another trial that indicated that remdesivir was not helpful. The problem is that it was an intravenous medication, and so it could really only be given satisfactorily in the hospital. And because it was an antiviral, we would think that it would seem to work better earlier on. One of the things that we understood was that the sicker people were, the less helpful remdesivir was. So it was something that we had. It was the first thing that we had, and so it was the only thing we had, so we used it. Another trial that came out, this was called the UK Recovery Trial, and they were looking at the question of whether or not very cheap steroids would be helpful in patients in the hospital. Why would that be the case? Well, steroids might reduce the cytokine storm since they are anti-inflammatories. And that UK recovery trial was a positive trial. It showed that there was about a 30% reduction in mortality, and it was immediately picked up as the standard care. It was sort of the cornerstone of the standard of care for inpatient treatment. So here was a trial that was funded by a number of universities and in the infrastructure in the UK, and it showed that a very cheap, easily accessible medication was very effective at reducing mortality. And whether you use dexamethasone or solumedrol, this was a breakthrough. So that's one of the treatments that we use currently in the hospital. Moving on from there, we had a number of other trials and looked at other medications. To this day, we use medications that reduce inflammation. For a time there, we used plasma, convalescent plasma. That showed later on to be not as effective as they had hoped, and so they've stopped using that. And so currently, right now, for inpatient medication use, really the studies that we have show that pretty much it's steroids when you get to the hospital. It's a number of other autoimmune, autoantibody, things like tocilizumab, these sorts of medications. And really, proning. Proning is one of the main things that we do in the hospital when we have a patient who is low on oxygen, is we make sure that they're laying on their belly. We don't know exactly all of the reasons why this works. We think it may be because it pulls the heart forward off of the lungs. It allows for better oxygenation in the posterior aspect of the lungs. I can tell you, I have personally seen patients sort of going down the tubes. And when we have become very aggressive and tried to convince the patient to really stay on their belly the whole time as much as they possibly could, we were able to avoid intubation on those patients and keep them and actually be discharged. So proning, I think, is one of those things that's really easy to do. It's not expensive, and it seems to work. Now let's talk about outpatient therapies. So one of the big problems with the COVID pandemic is the issue of hospitalization. We talk about the freedom of choice of whether or not we can take a vaccine. The problem is that if we choose not to take the vaccine, there are consequences to that. We know that people who take the vaccine are many times less likely to be admitted to the hospital. There was an independent study that was conducted by the Texas State Department of Public Health. This was not funded by any drug company or the federal government or the CDC. It was done by the Texas State Public Health Department, where they looked at people who were vaccinated versus people that weren't vaccinated. And they looked at the entire year, all of the data that they had. They broke it down by age. And it showed that people who were vaccinated were 40 times, 40, not 40%, not 40%, but 40 times less likely to be needed to be admitted to the hospital or even die. And so the issue that we've had is that when you have a lot of people who choose not to be unvaccinated, there's going to be a lot of people going to the hospital. And I've seen personally where people who we can't transfer patients. So I work in a small community hospital. If somebody comes in with a heart attack and we need to transfer that patient to a major university center that has the ability to do angiography, we can't transfer them because all the beds are full at that hospital. The patient stays at our hospital. They're not able to get the full amount of treatment and care that they would normally have gotten. And so we have to sort of make things happen. And I've already seen where basically patients were not able to get the standard of care because we were not able to transfer patients. And that's a real big issue. So one of the things that people have focused on is there a way that if you're not vaccinated and you come down with illness, is there a way that we can prevent those people from prevent them from having to go to the hospital so that they don't, use up all of the resources that we have at the hospital? That would be beneficial in two ways. Number one, the person getting sick would not die, would not need hospitalization. And number two, we would have more resources at the hospital to take care of people who don't have COVID-19. And so that's why you've seen an intense look at early medications that can be used that can perhaps prevent hospitalization. And one of the best examples of that was a study that's done down in Brazil. Actually, it was a Brazilian study it's an adaptive study. Actually, I'll explain what that means. That was sponsored by McMaster University in Ontario, Canada, and the Pontifical University in Brazil. It was not sponsored by any drug companies at all or the government. And basically what they asked was this question: is there cheap medications that can be used that has already been FDA approved that we can use to reduce the incidence of hospitalization and death? And so what they did in this study is they opened up several different arms. They had different arms for different medications. And what they would do is as people came into the study, they would randomize them to these different arms. And then as the people started to become enrolled in these studies, they would either get the medication or they would get the placebo. And they would peek in every once in a while to see if there was a difference between those two groups. And if there was a difference between the two groups that was significant enough, they stopped the trial and they would announce the results. They would not give any more people in that group placebo because they felt it was unethical to give people placebo when they knew that thing worked. But the other thing that they did was they looked in the trials to see whether or not things were working. And if they, for a period of time, if they did not see a separation between the intervention and the placebo, they would also cut the trial and say, we need to take patients and no longer enroll it into this arm and enroll it into a different arm that we're looking at. And they had 7 or 8 different interventions. And in fact, that trial is still going on even as we speak right now. So I'd like to update you on what they'd found. They had a hydroxychloroquine arm. They had an ivermectin arm. They had a fluvoxamine arm. And to this day, they had a metformin arm. They also have a interferon arm. and a number of other medications that they're looking at. So as it turns out, they stopped the hydroxychloroquine arm early because there was no difference between the placebo group and the intervention group. And so they stopped enrolling, and they're actually published that paper. In the ivermectin arm, they thought they saw some difference, but after enrolling even more patients, again, there was no difference, and they stopped the ivermectin arm because there was no difference between those groups. Interesting, though, they found a difference in the fluvoxamine group. Fluvoxamine is an antidepressant. It's known for increasing serotonin in patients, but it also has another effect where it hits a receptor in the mitochondria that shuts down inflammation. So this could be very helpful at preventing inflammation. And what they found was that fluvoxamine, 100 milligrams twice a day for 10 days, reduced the incidence of hospitalization in COVID-19 by 30%. And they made those results known. They published that in The Lancet, which is a very prestigious journal. And so today we have the ability to prescribe fluvoxamine, 100 milligrams twice a day to patients who come down with COVID early. And we're doing that right now, actually. We've actually prescribed some of those medications. So we're having some encouraging results. There's been a couple of other trials that have come out that maybe you've heard about. There's the Paxlovid one, which actually reduces not just 30%, but almost 90% reduction in hospitalizations and deaths. And then there's the molnupiravir, which is another medication, which was initially shown to reduce it by 50%, but after further data was released, it seems like it's around 30% as well. So, not all of these medications, you don't just need one medication because everybody's different. People are on different medications and there's different interactions. So it's better to have as many tools as possible in that tool shed. So hopefully we can reduce the number of people that are being admitted to the hospital so we can have the bandwidth in our hospital system to be able to take care of people who don't even have COVID. There are some patients who aren't able to get their cancer surgeries. There's some people that can't get even elective surgeries because they've shut down the operating rooms in these facilities. So hopefully we can move forward and we'll see how things go. So that's just a quick update on medications. What I'd really like to spend the bulk of my time on is actually some of the natural remedies and things that we've talked about in the past. So I'm a very big believer in the Swiss cheese model. What is the Swiss cheese model? So if you excuse my analogy of cheese, which is not a vegan thing, but it sort of tells you what I'm talking about, because the Swiss cheese model is there's multiple slices of cheese, but each one has its own holes. So the first thing that we have to understand is that nothing is 100% efficacious, okay? I don't know of any intervention in the entire history of medicine that works 100% of the time. I'm told that the only thing that we can depend on 100% of the time is death and taxes. And I know from my Bible education that Enoch and Elijah are both in heaven and never saw death. So really the only thing we can 100% depend on is taxes. And I live in the state of California, so I can certainly ascribe to that. But nevertheless, each one of these pieces of cheese, whether it's a vaccine, whether it's mask wearing, whether it's, a good diet, whether it's fresh air, whether it's sunshine, all of these things, sleep, all of these things protect, but they don't protect 100%. So the more slices of cheese you can put in, each with their own holes, hopefully the holes are in different places so that when you put that barrier up and the virus tries to get you, you have multiple layers of protection. So when medieval cities would put up their walls, they didn't just depend on the wall. They had soldiers, they had barriers, they were able to use weapons to protect themselves from the oncoming army. And that's the same thing that we must do, because isn't this a battle? Isn't this a battle where we are under siege? We must have multiple layers of protection. And I believe in all of those things that we can do, we should be doing it, because I don't believe that God is going to do for us what we can do for ourselves. So let's talk about some of these things that we can do for ourselves. Let's talk first about sleep. So one of the first things that I talked about way back in 2000 when this pandemic came out was the need for us to get enough sleep. And as a sleep specialist, I think this is kind of my grounding, centering area, since I know about this. We know that Americans today get far too little sleep. They should be getting at least 7 hours of sleep, and that's in adults. As we go down in age, they should be getting 8, 9, 10, 11 hours of sleep every night. We know that we're chronically sleep deprived. Here's the best evidence for knowing that we're sleep deprived. When we come to the time, and we're coming up to it here shortly in a few months, where we turn the hour ahead and we lose an hour of sleep, we are so sleep deprived that when we do that hour turning ahead of sleep, there are so many accidents on the freeway just that day. There are people that that die as a result of that 1 hour less of sleep. It's well documented that we as a humanity are literally stringing together the hours of sleep that we need, that when we turn just 1 hour ahead, that makes a tremendous impact on us as a population. So getting enough sleep, what about the evidence for that? Well, we know that in somebody, for instance, who gets a vaccination, in people who sleep at least 7 hours of sleep per night, the antibody titers after vaccination are twice that than what they are if you don't get enough sleep. I'm sure you could probably apply this to natural infection as well. Your immune system is able to mount a much better response if you're getting enough sleep. This also works in terms of stress. People who are under a lot of stress have stress illness, and it wears down the immune system. We have actual ways of measuring this with T cells, B cells, and antibody levels. What is it about sleep that does this? We don't know exactly biochemically all the things, but we do know that people who don't get enough sleep are susceptible to getting illnesses. And so in a situation where not everybody is going to the hospital, I mean, your immune system works 80, 90% of the time in these cases. Wouldn't it be better if we could enhance our immune system? We might see a reduction in the number of people going to the hospital. If you're talking about that, one of the things that you can do that's very cheap, it's not expensive, there's no drug company that's going to make money off of it, and it's going to help you not just in terms of COVID-19, it's going to help you in every other aspect, diabetes, Alzheimer's disease, in a number of ways. You'll find today that the truth is redundant. So sleep is really, really important. So I'll leave it there, but I'll be open for questions. The other thing that's really important is exercise. So there was a research lab. There is a research lab at McMaster University, the same university that sponsored the Together trial down in Brazil. And the director of that lab is a professor by the name of Jennifer Heiss. She's the director of the Fit Lab at McMaster University. And just like any university, they have students that are under stress. So she asked a question. She wanted to know, what is the effect of stress on mood? What is the effect of stress on inflammation? And on these cytokine markers that are so integral in terms of COVID-19. So she did an experiment. She took these students in the last 6 weeks of their term at McMaster University. This is a very stressful time for students. Obviously, they're taking tests that could define who they are and who they become for the rest of their lives. So they need to do well. And this is the last 6 weeks of the term. And so as exams are coming, the stress is building. So she divided these students that were enrolled in her study into 3 groups. The first group, she didn't have them do anything. They just continued to do what they were normally doing. However, the last 2 groups were both groups in where she asked them to exercise 20 minutes a day, just 3 times a week. So Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And in the first group, the first exercise group, she asked them to do it in a moderate sense. So this was not very exertive. This was maybe walking to jogging as they're talking, this sort of thing. Whereas the second group, it was much more exertive. So they got their heart rate up a little bit more, maybe 80% of max. If you want to figure out what your maximum estimated heart rate is, you simply take the number 220 and you subtract your age. So if you're 50 years of age, 220 minus your age is 170. That's your predicted maximum. So they were getting up to about 80% of their predicted maximum in this last group. So then what she did was she took a number of inventories on these groups, the no exercise, the moderate exercise, and the intense exercise group. And she measured what their mood was. That was using something called a Beck Inventory Scale 2. This is a way of measuring depression. She also measured their stress levels, their perceived stress levels, interferon levels, IL-6 levels. These are cytokines that that mean things in terms of inflammation. So then she let them go at it and then rounded them up at the end of the 6 weeks. And she looked at what the results were, and they were stunning. First of all, in the group that did not do any exercise at all, the control group, the amount of depression that had arose in those last 6 weeks was astounding, showing her that just 6 weeks of stress can have a tremendous impact on mood. Now, we've been in this, 2 years now? Can you imagine the effect of the stress level over the last 2 years? People losing their jobs, people losing loved ones. Tremendous amount of stress has happened in the last 2 years. And in just 6 weeks period of time, this is what can happen. But she also found that there were higher levels of interleukin-6 in this control group. So a whole bunch of things happened in terms of stress that was not good. Now, she looked at the two exercise groups, the moderate and the high intensity group. And in almost every single case, things were better in the exercise group, but things were best in which group? Which group do you think had the best overall results, the moderate or the high intensity group? And if you guys are test takers, you know that I'm trying to trick you here. And you know what the right answer is. It is actually the moderate intensity group had the best outcomes. They not only completely eliminated the increase in depression, they actually reduced. In other words, at the end of the 6 weeks, they were less depressed than they were when they started the trial. And it was also the same for the high intensity group. But when they got to stress and perceived stress, the moderate intensity group had less perceived stress than the high intensity group. And so what does all this mean? What it means is, number one, that exercise is beneficial for us, not just biochemically, but also mood. Okay, that's number one. Number two is that you don't have to be one of these people that you see on Instagram exercising. You don't have to be going to the gym. In fact, you don't want to be doing that high intensity exercise. You want to be doing low level, easy kind of stuff. And that alone is going to have a tremendous impact on how you feel and actually real markers that can predict inflammation. Look, if you're exercising 3 times a week, 20 minutes a day, and your IL-6 levels truly are lower, you're going to be in a better spot to be able to weather the storm of COVID-19. So sleep is very important. Exercise, extremely important. Now, the last thing I want to talk about before we open up for questions, or we could even talk more about diet, and we'll talk a little bit more about diet. One of the things that I've gotten really excited about in the last month or so is reading about light. Light has a tremendous impact. Now, you've heard about how light can anchor your circadian rhythm. This is the rhythm that tells you when you get up in the morning and when you go to bed at night. You have probably already heard that exposure to light, bright light, especially at night, can shut down melatonin production in the pineal gland of your brain and cause you to have a bad night's sleep. You've probably heard about that too as well. But what you probably haven't heard about is the effect of sunshine on the body during the day. Okay. Now, one of the things that I find very fascinating is this idea about metabolic stress. Let me back up a little bit before we talk about a little bit more about light. Inside of your cells, okay, we're going to have a little bit of a biochemistry lesson here. Inside of your cells are little organelles inside the cell called mitochondria. These mitochondria are the powerhouses of the cells. They make ATP, which is the currency of energy for your body. Nothing happens in your body without ATP being utilized. Now, imagine these mitochondria are like engines in your cells. Just like an internal combustion engine, it uses gasoline and it causes locomotion, but as a byproduct of that locomotion, heat is incurred. And that heat, if not dealt with, can actually ruin the engine and shut it down. And that's exactly the situation that we have with mitochondria. Mitochondria takes fats, sugars, and proteins and basically metabolizes it into very high energy electrons. Now, what it tries to do next is a miracle when it comes to biology, because it takes these high energy electrons and it leverages the energy of these electrons to make ATP. But in the process of doing it, it takes oxygen and puts these electrons on oxygen. Now, that's a very dangerous thing to do biochemically, because whenever that happens, if it's not done completely appropriately to make water, it can make something called hydroxy radicals. Now, these hydroxy radicals are extremely dangerous molecules that can break down proteins in a split second. And in fact, if it's right next to the machinery, it can actually cause the machine to seize up. Just like an internal combustion engine. If the heat is too high, the engine can be seized up. So what you need to do is you need to have a coolant system. And that's what any car has, is a very good coolant system with oil and water. Our body, though, has a coolant system for the mitochondria, because the way to take care of these hydroxy radicals, which are extremely dangerous, is an antioxidant system. So antioxidants are very important in neutralizing the oxidative effects of these hydroxy radicals. So we've known for a long time about things like catalase, things like glutathione peroxidase, things like superoxide dismutase. These are things that have been well studied. But scientists now, in the last year or two, and maybe 3, have discovered that there is the mother of all antioxidants, and it's produced right there in the mitochondria. And you'll never guess what this antioxidant is, but it's melatonin. And this comes as a shock. They've done a lot of studies to show that serotonin in the mitochondria is converted into melatonin right on the spot where it's needed to mop up these antioxidants. Now, why is this important? Because if it doesn't do that, the mitochondria can become diseased and damaged. Now, if you go to the Cleveland Clinic's website and look up what it is, what diseases are tied to bad mitochondria, you will see that diseases like diabetes, hypertension, high coronary artery disease, autism, dementia, Parkinson's, all of these things are tied to mitochondrial disease. And so it's very important that our mitochondria be working well. So you're probably thinking at this point, well, I should probably be taking a melatonin supplement. Well, what I'm about to tell you next is going to blow your mind, because what we are now discovering is this whole idea of melatonin in the brain being secreted at night. What we're finding out is that melatonin in the brain being secreted at night is the backup. It's the backup plan. It's not the actual plan. The real plan to keep the mitochondria working well and making sure that they're producing melatonin, you'll never guess. The stimulus for mitochondria to make melatonin is actually sunlight. And this is mind-blowing, because when you look at sunlight, well, first of all, don't look at sunlight, but when you start to study about sunlight, you'll see that, and I'll use a lot of C puns here, okay, that over 50% of the energy coming from the sun is something called infrared radiation. It's light that you can't see with the human eye. It's past the red. You have ultraviolet, which is past violet, and that we know is something that is associated with vitamin D. But infrared radiation, which comes from the sun, and we perceive it as heat. So you know what happens if you stand with your back to the sun and it's a bright sunny day, you'll feel warmth on your back. What you're doing is you're actually feeling infrared radiation coming down from the sun, penetrating through the atmosphere, going through your clothes, and actually penetrating deep within your skin to those thermal receptors, and it's warming it up. So that's the one thing that you should know about infrared radiation. Infrared radiation penetrates deeply. Let me give you an example. You're sitting at a stoplight. A bunch of teenagers pull up next to you. They're in their car, and they're playing that music that they call music that we call noise, right? What is it that you hear? All you hear is the boom, boom, boom. That's the low frequency sounds, because low frequency is very good at penetrating things. So it penetrates their car, goes through the air, penetrates your car, and goes to your ears. So low frequency, high wavelength, long wavelength energy can penetrate. Now, there's some studies which seem to indicate that infrared radiation can penetrate up to 1 centimeter, even up to 8 centimeters. into your skin. So if you are a normal sized person, not obese, you can quickly see that if you were to look 8 centimeters deep around your whole body, that would be the majority of your cells in your body. And so what we're saying here is that infrared radiation from the sun penetrates deeply into your body, and it causes the production of melatonin on site immediately to cause the mopping up of the hydroxy radicals, which can damage mitochondria. Now, I want you to think about this. It's important for us to be in sunlight for a couple of reasons. Infrared radiation starts as soon as the sun starts to come up, it gets higher. And as the sun is going down, you have infrared radiation until the sun finally sets. Ultraviolet light, which is responsible for making vitamin D, happens only really between 10 o'clock in the morning and 2 o'clock in the evening. So it's important, by the way, also that you understand that infrared radiation, you don't have to be standing in the sun, because infrared radiation is everywhere. It can bounce off of trees. In fact, it's very efficient at bouncing off anything that's green. If you were to take an infrared photograph, for instance, and look at trees and grass, they would look as though they had snow on them because they're absolutely white. They are reflecting a lot of the infrared radiation from the trees and the grass to you. And of course, even if you're wearing clothes, it's going to penetrate your clothes, penetrate your skin, and get to the mitochondria to make sure that your mitochondria is bathed in that coolant system of melatonin. So in actuality, if you think about this, we were really designed to be getting sun exposure outside of the house during the day to keep our mitochondria in shape. But then at night, when the sun goes down and we're not able to do it, the backup plan is the melatonin secretion, which then secretes melatonin into the body, and the melatonin can come into the mitochondria and continue that bathing so that the mitochondria don't become overheated. I thought this was fascinating because if you look at what has happened to the human race over the last 100 years, we used to spend about 50% of the time outside in the sunlight 100 years ago. Today, we spend 7% of our waking hours outside. We have a problem with going outside. If you look at COVID-19, the SARS-2 receptor comes in and it binds to the ACE2. ACE2 then gets completely knocked out of the situation. It's no longer active. And you have to understand that ACE2 is one of the important enzymes in balancing oxidative stress in the body. So think about this. If you're not outside, if you have a relative low melatonin, intramitochondrial melatonin level, in other words, if you're running your engine hot, okay, and now coronavirus comes in, knocks out your ACE2, it's as if you're running your engine hot and now you're starting to go uphill. You know what's going to happen. Your engine is going to overheat and you're going to stall out on the hill. And so this is what we're seeing. People who are obese, people who have oxidative stress, people who have low melatonin levels in their mitochondria because they're not going outside, they're not getting a good night's sleep. These are the people that are at risk for basically falling apart. And we know that when those cells in the body start to get oxidative stress, they start to break down and they become thrombogenic. They cause clots. And we know that people with COVID-19 have 9 times the clots that people who don't have COVID-19 do. And so when you're putting all of this together, you start to realize that we need to be out in the sun much more than we are. Interesting. It's been well known that we have many, many studies that show that people who are outside in the sun, people who are outside in general, have better gray matter in their brain. They live better. They live more healthy. They have less depression. It was well known enough that I recently spoke to a neurosurgeon who did her training up in Seattle, and they had something in the hospital. It's a very old hospital that she did her training at. They had something called a solarium, where they would actually take patients outside and made sure that they got enough sunlight. So we've noticed here for a long period of time that vitamin D levels were tied to outcomes. But we've noticed that giving vitamin D doesn't always seem to help in patients who come down with COVID-19. So there was a study that was done in Scotland where they looked at the United States, they looked at the UK, and they looked at Italy. And they looked at, it was over a winter season, so the sun was pretty low in the sky. So low, in fact, that the authors of the study basically said that it was so low that there was no way sunlight exposure at that level could produce enough vitamin D to have any effect on COVID outcomes. Nevertheless, what they saw was that people living in higher latitudes had a higher mortality rate from COVID-19 than those in lower latitudes in those three countries. In other words, what they said was sunlight exposure seemed to be protective of COVID-19 in a way that was independent of vitamin D. So I believe it would be a mistake to say, I'm going to take my vitamin D supplement and now I don't need to go out into the sun. I think there is something that is going on. I've already explained to you what I believe it is. I believe it's infrared radiation, and it's helping us quite a bit. Now, think about this. These hospitals that were built back in the 1920s, sanitariums that were built in the Northeast of the United States, there was a lot of specific instructions, specifically in the Adventist sanitariums. Ellen White was very clear what type of surroundings that these sanitariums should have. They had to be surrounded by trees, by grass. These are the very things that scientists are now showing that seem to reflect the infrared radiation the best. In fact, if you were to go to Google and Google a infrared photograph of Central Park, one of the things that you would find very quickly in that photograph is that the big tall buildings of the downtown are black. They don't reflect any infrared at all. But the trees and the grass seem to reflect a tremendous amount of infrared. And we know already from studies that have been done that people that live in green environments are healthier, they're happier, they're more intelligent, they make better choices. Ellen G. White, who was one of the top 100 notable people by Smithsonian Magazine, wrote this in the Health Reformer on May 1st, 1871. And just to think about what she would have known. Now remember what we said about infrared radiation. She said, the feeble one should press out into the sunshine as earnestly and naturally as do the shaded plants and vines. The pale and sickly grain blade that has struggled up out of the cold of early spring puts out the natural and healthy deep green after enjoying for a few days the health and life-giving rays of the sun. Go out into the light and warmth of the glorious sun, you pale and sickly ones, and share with vegetation its life-giving, health-dealing power. The Health Reformer, May 1st, 1871. Now, I want you to notice again what she said. Remember, how is it that we feel infrared radiation? We feel infrared radiation based on heat. That's how we feel it. Notice what she said. She says, go out into the light and warmth of the glorious sun. It seems to me as though there was an indication there that she might have understood that there was more to the sun than just the visible spectrum, that maybe the infrared radiation that we're getting is actually very important. Finally, I will end on a on diet. So first of all, I believe that sleep is extremely important. And number two, I believe that we need to get out into the sun. I don't care if you live in Michigan. I don't care if you live in Norway. The sun that comes out even in the wintertime is sufficient to give you enough infrared radiation. Have you ever noticed in the wintertime that it'll snow and then maybe it'll warm up a little bit? The sun will come up. What will the sun do to the snow? It melts it. What's melting that snow is infrared radiation, the same infrared radiation that can penetrate your warm clothes, go down into your skin, and cause the reaction that it needs to do in the mitochondria. So let's move on from sun. Let's talk about diet. And I want to talk to you really briefly about meat, since we're talking about vegetarianism. I think one of the most exciting areas for me in terms of diet that's coming out now is this idea of sialic acids. Okay, so let's break down what sialic acids are. Sialic acids are 9 carbon sugars which are on the exterior of every human cell. It's the way that the immune system recognizes cells. So these are the tip top. So in other words, if proteins are my hand, glycoproteins are my the base of my fingers. The sialic acids are the fingertips. Okay. Now, human beings only make one type of sialic acid. They make a sialic acid called NEU, N-E-U, 5-AC. NEU 5-AC. Okay. NEU 5-AC. AC is the key. That is the type of sialic acid that we make. Almost every other animal that's a mammal, with very few exceptions, makes two types of sialic acids. They make NEU 5-AC, but they also make NEU 5-GC. Now, that's important to understand, because if they have NEU 5-AC and GC on the surface of their cells, if we go and eat them, that means when we're digesting their cells into our body, the NEU 5-AC and NEU 5-GC that were in their bodies don't get digested completely, but in fact get reabsorbed into our body. And our enzymes in our body can't recognize the difference between NEU 5-AC and NEU 5-GC, and it will put either one of those onto our cells. So in other words, if I've never eaten an animal before, all of the sialic acids in my body will be NEU 5-AC. But the very first time I eat an animal, or drink milk, or eat cheese, these are the things that contain these sialic acids. Not white meat. It is not in chicken. It is not in fish. It is in red meat. Okay, so that would be pig, cow, sheep, cheese, milk, all of those types of things. When I eat that, my cells will now have on their surface not only NEU 5-AC, which my body recognizes as self, but NEU 5-GC, which the body does not recognize as self and has antibodies against. So when I eat those things, I will get a low-grade cyalitis, or a inflammatory reaction. Why is this important? It's because for years, scientists have tried to understand what is it about red meat that seems to be very atherogenic. It seems to cause inflammation in the blood vessels. We see that people that eat high amounts of red meat, they have higher levels of coronary disease, higher levels of atherosclerosis, higher levels of heart attacks, strokes, things of that nature. And so a very elegant study was done in France, which carefully monitored in individuals how much of what food they ate. And they were able to, because in different foods, there's different amounts of NEU 5-GC. They had a very nice chart. I'm glad it was a French study, because they had just about every type of cheese on there, from mozzarella to hard cheese. Mozzarella had hardly any NEU 5-GC in it. And hard cheese had a tremendous amount of NEU 5-GC. And so they were able to figure it out and basically 5-GC quantify these people. So once they did that, they were able to go through and measure in their blood how much NEU 5-GC antibodies they had circulating. And wouldn't you know it, they were able to correlate the amount of NEU 5-GC in the diet with NEU 5-GC antibodies in the blood. Finally correlating these two things and proposing on pretty solid evidence that this is the reason why these things lead to colon cancer, these things lead to atherosclerosis, and a number of other things. So tying that in, inflammation is not good. Inflammation is actually quite bad, especially for COVID-19. Let's jump to the last study that we'll talk about before we take questions. And that is a study that was done looking at a network of healthcare providers in the UK, France, Italy, Germany, the United States. And what they did, this was a network that was made up to compare notes. So they would call each other, they would talk to each other. Well, there was a study that they decided to do, and they used this network of people. So most of the people in this study, if not all, 90% of them were physicians. About 10% of them were nurses, 90% of them were male, 10% were female. I may be rounding off those numbers, but that's kind of the general thing. And there was a few thousand in this study. And they asked this very particular question. They said, does your diet identify with, and there was really basically two choices. Is it a plant-based diet, whole grain diet? Or is it a high protein, low carb diet, like an Atkins diet or a paleo diet? So those are the two main things that they divided into. There was other types, but those are the main two. And they wrote down, okay, is this person, what kind of a physician are they? Where are they working? Are they working around people that have COVID? So they did a bunch of co-founder evaluations. And then what they did was they plotted multi-regression analysis, so to try to control for all of these variables that might have an impact. And what they found at the end of the day was that those physicians, those nurses that stuck to, and remember, let me just back up here. These are all physicians and nurses. They are not, this is a very homogeneous group of people. Okay. They're not socioeconomically challenged. Okay. They probably have very similar education. So here you have an opportunity to knock out a bunch of variables of a very homogeneous group of people, and then you control for what job they have in the hospital and how much they're exposed. And then you ask the question about diet. This is pretty strong, okay? So what they found was that those that were on a high protein, low carbohydrate diet, paleo diet, Atkins diet, that type, had fourfold increased risk for severe COVID-19 as compared to those that had a plant-based diet. So I think that's really interesting. I think it's one of the first studies that I have seen on this that is looking at diet and COVID-19 outcomes. So we have already talked about diet and COVID-19 outcomes. We've already looked at a number of these other categories, and I think all of this is pointing in the same direction. If we want to reduce our chances of getting sick, these are the things that we ought to do. Dr. Wells.
Thank you, Dr. Schweltz. Yes, I saw that study as well that was talking about the healthcare providers who followed a plant-based diet and how it was protective against COVID-19. We do have several questions. Before we go into these questions, Dr. Schweltz, I just wanted to share just a couple of things with the audience. So I'm going to just put you in the background for a second, and then I'm going to bring you back in about 5 minutes so that we can answer all the questions that we have. And so what I wanted to do today was just give you guys a little bit of extra information about how to protect yourself against COVID. And so here I'm just going to share a few slides with you about healthy living for improved immunity. And so this is just going to go through just a few ways of things that you can do on a daily basis. And some of these are things that Dr. Schweltz mentioned, and he mentioned in way more in depth than I'm going to go into, but just to help you to understand how to keep your immune system in optimal condition. And so nutrition is optimal for supporting immune function because what it does is it helps to support the immune system to initiate effective responses against pathogens. And what that does is also to help mitigate inappropriate immune responses when necessary and to help prevent chronic inflammation. So what you eat is important to helping your immune system function optimally. Plant substances such as monounsaturated fatty acids, fiber, antioxidants, and polyphenols, they all support optimal immune function. And so you see here a list of foods that I have here, and all these foods, and there's many, many more, but these are some of your top foods that are important for immune function. So you see I have things like garlic and green vegetables and eggplant and bell peppers and fruits. All of these substances have these phytonutrients, which are important for optimal immune function. So putting a variety of foods into your diet, a variety of plant foods into your diet can help your immune system to function at its best. There's a lot of evidence about elderberry. And so if you don't have elderberry, I would tell you, get you some elderberry. And elderberries have demonstrated that, have demonstrated that elderberry is a potent immune modulator. And it does this through its antiviral and anti-inflammatory effects. So it's really, really important. And I recommend to all of my patients that they even before COVID, I was recommending during cold and flu season that they always keep elderberry around because it's just good at helping to support immune function. Other things like zinc, which are found in plant-based foods, selenium, vitamin C, and vitamin D, as Dr. Schweltz mentioned. All of these micronutrients are important for immunity. And so increasing them, and I recommend that people not necessarily do so much supplementation, but actually add the whole foods. Because when you add whole foods, you're going to get the other nutrients, the other phytochemicals that are in that food that are going to, again, help you to have optimal immunity. Water, we also know, is important for immunity because it helps to remove toxins from the body and helps to support appropriate immune function. Sleep, as Dr. Schweltz mentioned, is important in terms of immunity because it has anti-inflammatory effects, and it helps to decrease the production of important immune regulating cells, and it helps to reduce or increase rather the body's susceptibility, helps to decrease, the body's susceptibility to infection and inflammation. So I know Dr. Schweltz talked a lot about sleep. And so we know that sleep is important. And we know that there are questions in the chat about sleep that he's going to answer as well. Also, he mentioned about sunlight. So there's nothing more we can say about sunlight, but also vitamin D, which also comes from the sun, can also help to support and enhance function of immune cells such as macrophages, T and B cells, and it also, we know that it's important in helping with COVID-19. Exercise was also mentioned, that appropriate levels of exercise release immune modulators, and they help to promote an anti-inflammatory response. I would also tell people too that too much exercise is also bad. So you want to make sure that you're getting a balance of having enough exercise and having rest periods in between your exercise sessions. Also, being temperate is important as well. We know things like drinking alcohol can disrupt the gastrointestinal barrier, and that decreases its integrity, and that allows for leakage of harmful microorganisms into the blood. And then also nicotine can inhibit the normal immune response. So avoiding nicotine and alcohol can also be important with helping with immune function. And then also, spirituality is important because research has shown that people who are more religious or spiritual can adapt more quickly to health problems and have better mental health. And this improvement in mental health and well-being also has positive physiological benefits on health, risk of disease, and response to treatment. And so because we know we're a church entity, that we believe that trusting God is important. And we also know that trusting in God helps to alleviate stress, which can weaken the immune function. And so I just wanted to give you guys a little bit of extra information there, since we didn't have Dr. Standish to talk about and just to help us with understanding how we can do things in our daily life to help us with our immune function, to help us to be able to survive and do well during the pandemic. And so I'm going to bring you back, Dr. Schweltz. I just wanted to share that information. And we have several different questions here. And so I'm going to go back to the first question. And the first question was about that they've heard that the most productive hours for sleep are before midnight. Is that true?
Yeah, so it's true. And the reason why it's true is because the type of sleep that you get towards the beginning of the night is a type of sleep called slow wave sleep, otherwise known as delta sleep, otherwise known as N3 sleep. And it's during this phase of sleep that's very physically restorative, and it's tied to growth hormone secretion. And it doesn't happen later on in the night, because later on in the night is the time for REM sleep, which is a different type of sleep that's more mentally restorative. And so if you look at all of these things, there is a time for you to sleep. And what's even more important to understand is this, is that if your circadian rhythm is programmed for you to become sleepy and fall asleep at night at, let's just say, 12 o'clock midnight, then and you go to bed at 12 o'clock midnight, but you've got to get up at 5 in the morning, you're only getting 5 hours of sleep. It's going to be the wrong thing to do if you all of a sudden listen to what we're talking about here and say, I need 7 hours of sleep. I am now, because I have to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, I'm now going to go to bed at 10 o'clock at night, because your circadian rhythm is set for you to fall asleep at midnight, and you're going into bed at 10. You know what's going to happen if you go to bed at 10 and your brain is only ready to go to sleep at 12? You're going to be wide awake in bed for 2 hours. And if there's one thing that's going to make you very anxious, is the fact that you can't fall asleep when you want to fall asleep. So I want to be very careful. When I tell people that they need to get 7 hours of sleep, they need to make sure that they get their programmed fall asleep time from 12 o'clock back to 10 o'clock. Well, how do you do that? Well, the way you do that is by reverse engineering how it got to 12 o'clock in the first place. And that's very important to talk about, because what we do, what our circadian rhythm does, is it gets cues from our eyes, from light. If it sees light late at night, it thinks that it needs to delay the circadian rhythm, especially blue light, stuff, the kind of light that you get out of your computer or your cell phone or your iPad or any other disastrous electronic device after 9 o'clock at night. And so if you're exposing your eyes to those things late at night, you're going to start to fall asleep later and later and later. So the way to do that, the way to get it back, number one, is shut those things off 2 to 3 hours before you go to bed, so you're not exposing your eyes to that light. But another thing that you can do in addition to that is when you get up in the morning, the first thing when you get up in the morning, whether it's 6 o'clock, 5, 6, 7, in that range, is make sure you're exposing your eyes to bright light. Now, the brightest light, if the sun is up, is outside. If the sun is not up, then you can get a light box, and we can talk more about that. But if the sun is up, going outside, even if it's a cloudy day, is going to be more efficacious than staying inside. If you expose your eyes to bright light in the morning, avoid light exposure at night, and then go to bed earlier, you're going to get those 7 hours of sleep. And I guarantee you're going to feel better after a good night's sleep.
Great, thanks. I know you talked about melatonin earlier, and you mentioned about that light. And I was reading and doing a presentation earlier, and that the blue light from the devices we use, our phones, our computers, can actually decrease your melatonin production. So that's important to think about too. So someone asked, I know you said that getting sunlight is the best way to get our melatonin.
Yep.
But for someone who's having difficulty sleeping, they ask, is it okay for them to take a melatonin supplement?
Yeah, it's okay to take a melatonin supplement. I would recommend taking a lower dose, so really no more than 5 milligrams. I think the higher dose you take of melatonin, the more irritated you become. I don't know if it's because it doesn't work or if it just causes irritation. But I would take it about an hour or so before you plan on going to bed.
Okay, great. Does the infrared penetrate through coats, hats, scarves, and gloves in the cold of Chicago?
Yeah, let me tell you, there is a paper out there. So the answer is yes, but let me expand a little bit more. There is a paper out there that I read that was written by a light engineer and a professor in medicine. And what they were suggesting was just literally mind-blowing. And I say that literally because what they're proposing is that not only can infrared radiation penetrate through clothes and skin, but it can also penetrate, now get this, through your skull. Okay. Now we have evidence. We already know that people who tend to be outside more have more gray matter in the old noggin. But what this light researcher, light engineer was showing was that when the light comes down and penetrates through the skull, the cerebral spinal fluid that surrounds the brain takes the light and diffuses it around the entire brain. And then the sulci and the gyri, those are like the deep crevices in the brain, direct that energy down into the deepest crevices. And there it's able to stimulate metabolism, increase ATP. And we know, I mean, this is a very tantalizing theory if you connect the dots, because we know that students that have natural light in school are able to study better. They have better test scores. All of these things increase when students are subjected to natural light. That's what's really disturbing, is this trend toward, thinking about where are we getting our infrared radiation. We're outside less and we're inside more. And the lights that we used to use, like incandescent bulbs, used to give off infrared radiation. Now the LED bulbs, the fluorescent bulbs, they give off literally no infrared radiation at all. And so the question is, if this is tied to autism and these sorts of things, is it possible that what we need to be doing is getting our kids outside into the light? Now, Christina, you'll remember when you went to medical school. Tell me if you remember this. Do you remember because at first I had trouble believing that light could penetrate the skull, but tell me if you remember in your physical diagnosis class, they used to put a light on the maxillary sinus and you could look from the mouth underneath. And if it was illuminating the mouth, you could tell that the maxillary sinus was open, correct?
Right.
So that's visible spectrum that's able to penetrate the skull. If visible spectrum can penetrate the skull, then you know that infrared can do it because it's much more penetrance.
Right. So it goes through all those coats that we have to wear that you guys don't have to think about over there in sunny California.
That's right.
But you know what? The other thing that we hear, though, there's another question about, you hear about skin cancer from being in the sun. So someone asked, what do you suggest then? We're told, you're telling us to be in the sun more, then my doctor's telling me that, I have to be worried about skin cancer. So what should we do?
Okay, good question. So remember that ultraviolet radiation is the type of radiation that causes cancer the most. All energy can cause cancer. But if you were to look at a graph looking at the entire spectrum, you would see that the type of light that carries with it the most risk of cancer, skin cancer, is ultraviolet radiation. Ultraviolet radiation is the highest when you're between 10 o'clock in the morning and 2 o'clock in the afternoon, when the sun is the highest in the sky. The reason why it is, by the way, is because when the sun is the highest in the sky, it has less atmosphere to penetrate. The atmosphere does a very good job, the ozone layer specifically, at preventing ultraviolet light from getting down to the surface. That's why it's difficult in the wintertime, based on just sunlight, to get enough vitamin D. It's almost exactly the same light. It's UVA that causes the cancer. It's UVB that gives you vitamin D. Here's the good news. To be able to get the benefit of infrared radiation, you don't have to be directly in the sun. You can still have clothes on. The ultraviolet B radiation and A can somewhat go through glass. B cannot go through glass, and it's certainly not going to be going through clothes. You can put sunscreen on. Ultraviolet is not going to penetrate sunscreen, but you can be sure that infrared will. So early in the day, when the sun is rising, that's a perfect time to be outside. Very little risk of having problems with skin cancer from ultraviolet radiation, but you're still getting infrared. Late in the day, when the sun is setting, the sun has got to cut through so much atmosphere that there's hardly any harmful ultraviolet radiation coming through, but there's still a lot of infrared. You know that when you look at a sunset. I mean, it's already there in the reds and the yellows. The other thing that's really interesting, since we're on the topic, is fire. For centuries, for millennia, at night, we didn't have electricity. Women would gather around fires at night for warmth. First of all, fire gives off a tremendous amount of infrared radiation. It's a hot body of light that's coming out. And you know that when you stand too close to the fire, let's say you stand with your back to the fire, and what happens? You can feel that heat through the clothes. That's infrared radiation penetrating through your clothes and hitting your skin, and it's penetrating deep into your skin and triggering your heat receptors in your skin. So clearly. But here's the other part that's interesting. You talked about blue light causing melatonin shutdown at night. We know that those intrinsic photosensitive retinal ganglion cells are actually in the inferior portion of our retina, but they're not in the superior portion of our retina. What does that mean? Because light gets flipped around when it hits our lens, that means the type of light at night that's going to do the most damage in terms of shutting down melatonin is light up high. So lights that are up on our ceiling and that are white, but lights that are down low, like, those plug-in night lights, those type of things don't seem to hit the receptors that shut down the melatonin as much as the ones up here. And if you think about it, at night, when you're sitting in front of a fire, the fire is usually down low. It's usually infrared. It's not blue. So, it's almost like God designed us in mind with what he was going to give us to sustain us, like fire and all of these sorts of things. It's really an interesting story.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. There's another question about, do you recommend SAD light therapy box or a screen to get more sunlight?
Yeah. So SAD stands for seasonal affective disorder. And absolutely about 4% of the population has this. It's fairly common. What you can do is you can buy these light boxes. First of all, they should be around 10,000 lux. Lux is a way of measuring the density of light. So it's 10,000 lux. And you should sit about 13 inches away from the box. And you really should sit in front of the box for about 20 minutes a day. It's fairly common in high latitudes, like you folks up there in Michigan, who don't get enough light, especially this time of year. This is the time of year where depression levels are very high. So yes, absolutely. I highly recommend those things if that's something that you deal with.
All right. And our last question, and I'll let you hone it. And if you need me to help, I'll help out with this question. What do you think of a low carb, mostly plant-based diet? Can the lecithin and whole wheat bread cause problems in our blood and lead to a leaky gut?
Yeah, I don't buy the leaky gut theory. I'll tell you that straight off, right off the bat. Tomatoes, hey, I'm a big fan of Bob the tomato. Tomatoes are great. I don't think they cause leaky gut. I think God gave us. I mean, if you think about this from a biblical standpoint, what was it that was the perfect diet in Eden? It was all of those seeds. We talked about this at the very beginning. It was the seeds, the grains, fruits. Tell me, is a tomato a fruit? Yes, it's a fruit. It was only after sin came in that vegetables were then added in to the diet, and then finally, of course, meat after certain types of meat, that is clean meat, after the flood. So I think that a carbohydrate diet is perfectly fine so long as it's complex carbohydrates. Where I have a problem is where you have high fructose corn syrup. And so not all sugars are the same. High fructose corn syrup, fruit drinks, these sorts of things where you give high concentrations of sugar to the liver, it's going to store it as liver fat, and it's going to be a problem. When you eat a fruit, it's complexed in with fiber. It's a slow release, and the body's able to deal with it. So yeah, I don't buy the leaky gut syndrome.
Right. And I'll add to that what you want to avoid is a low carb diet. Low carb diets are actually not healthy. And as you mentioned, there are different types of carbohydrates. Eating a donut is different from eating a piece of fruit. And so when you think about the gut microbiome and the microorganisms that live in the gut, they prefer high fiber foods. So you don't want to avoid bread. You just want to eat bread that's high in fiber. You don't want to avoid fruit, even if you're diabetic, because the fruit has fiber and other phytonutrients in it. And as a whole food, it's going to give you the balance that you need to be healthy. So in my patients who have chronic disease, who have diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, I'm definitely telling them you want to be on a high carb diet, but that high carb diet needs to be high fiber, right? It needs to be those complex carbohydrates, avoiding the simple carbohydrates, like you mentioned, like the candy, the sweets, the fruit juices, but getting those whole foods, that whole food plant-based diet which will give us all the nutrients that we need to help us in chronic disease prevention, keep our immunity strong, and help us to live healthy lives. And so I want to thank everyone today for joining us, for being on this presentation. Dr. Schweltz, I thank you so much for all the information. You make us scientists, whether we want to be it or not. I know that there's some complex information here, but I like the way that you give it to us, because what you do is allow us to be able to understand that there is meaning and purpose behind this. And that we're not just getting on this and just telling you a whole bunch of stuff, but this is why these things work. And so science and God can definitely be blended, because God created science. And so we know that it's important to understand what it is in our lifestyles that can help us to have healthy living, and that could also hinder us. So we definitely want to encourage people, as you're starting out this new year, to exercise more, sleep more, get more sunlight, eat your plant-based diet that is full of high fiber, low fat foods, and definitely also take care of your mental health, because we know that that is important too, in the times that we are living. And so we thank you again for joining us this afternoon. We're going to have so many more programs coming up. We're also thankful to the Vegan Museum for partnering with us on this project today. And we ask you to keep looking on the outlook for programs that we have coming up in February and in March. We want to thank you again for joining us today. And I'm just going to end today, because we are a church organization, with a word of prayer. Actually, Dr. Schweltz, I'm going to ask you to end us with a word of prayer.
Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for giving us science, but also your word, and to illuminate your word with science, the second book. Help us to understand it better and to trust in more in what you are telling us. In thy name, amen.
Amen. Everyone, have a good evening. Happy New Year, and take care.